Welcome to another episode of Dev Bootcamp Live. This is your host, Juan Lizarazo.
And I'm Jared Potter. We created the Dev Bootcamp Live podcast because we, as software engineers here in the Salt Lake City area, noticed that there was a gap between students who finished their bootcamp and actually getting into the industry. So that's what we're here to do. Quick recap of last week, we talked about how to keep motivated after you finish your boot camp and you no longer have that structured system in place. So we encourage you guys to go back and watch our episode 2 to see that. This last week, we've also been getting on a lot more platforms, and Juan's going to tell us about that.
Yeah, so we are now in Spotify, right? So if you have Spotify, just find us there, do Dev Bootcamp Live, subscribe, follow. If you're watching this on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button, turn on the notifications so you know every time we publish a new episode. We're also on, there are multiple platforms. We are also in Pocket Cast. We are also in Anchor.fm. We also went live in another platform. I don't remember all of the platforms, but if you search for us, we're like in our Twitter, I'm gonna be sharing today. We're gonna be sharing the links to all the platforms so you can find us. I mean, it's so hard to keep track of all of them, but whatever you're listening to this on, just subscribe. So yeah, so let's start with today's topic. Something that is very critical when you graduate as a new graduate, right? When you finish your program, whatever that is, computer science or your dev bootcamp program, something that happens is like you're going to have at some point to have a technical interview, right? And in a technical interview, they're going to ask you JavaScript questions. So today's topic, Jared, we're going to share with our audience key JavaScript concepts that they should know for their next technical interview. So key JavaScript concepts, right, that they should know for their next technical interview. Something crucial here that is very important for you listening out there is that you have to do two things today. First, you have to write down each of these concepts that we're going to tell you, just the concept, just the word, whatever we're sharing. And the second thing, you have homework. You have to search and read everything you can find about that topic. Since here we're just going to do a high-level overview on that. So it's not like a comprehensive guide that you're going to be just ready with it. We're just creating exposure so you know what to focus on and learn. So let's start, Jared. Let's start with this. So I'm going to start, right? I'm going to start since I'm sharing this topic today. So when you go to a technical interview, there's going to be usually a theoretical part where they're going to ask you just questions, right? It's just ask, answer, right? They're testing your knowledge on the language. And one of the important things is that you got to know JavaScript. Like usually you are relying on React or Angular or Vue or some frameworks, but you don't really know what's going under the hood, especially because you're a new software engineer, and that's normal. But we want you today to focus on JavaScript and learn all these concepts so you can nail that interview and get that first job. Okay. So yeah, so the first topic I want to share today, and this is a classical, I guarantee you this one comes in every technical interview for a new software engineer, a junior software engineer. Okay. So the question is like, usually is what's the difference? What's the difference between, well, that would be the question, but the concept, but let's share the concept first. I want to do it more, let's do it more fun. I'm going to share the concept, Jared, I'm going to share the concept, and then you're going to come with the interview question. Okay. So we're going to do that. I almost just screwed up here. Okay. So, there's two things that are called undefined and null, okay? And that comes in every JavaScript interview. So null, this is the key concept. You got to know the difference between those two. So null, it's a value, right, that defines the intentional absence of a value, okay? So when you have a variable and you assign it to null, you are declaring or initializing with an intentional absence of a value. That's null. And undefined is a value that is automatically assigned to every variable you declare. So if you declare any variable in JavaScript and you do not initialize it, it's going to have undefined assigned automatically. So go read everything you can about null and undefined, more structure definitions of these you can paraphrase when you're in your interview. But if you understand those two differences, you're going to nail it if you explain similar to what I just did. So Jared, go ahead. How would you ask this in a technical interview?
Yeah, no, I think I appreciate you giving me the easy one first here, but it's, I mean, really it is what's the difference between null and undefined? And I think that you alluded to the point there of null, it has to be intentionally set. At no point are you going to see null being accidentally set. It is intentional, whereas undefined is the absence of there being a variable there, either on an object or not. But yeah, the question would be, what's the difference between null and undefined? That's really the core question that's being asked.
Awesome. That's a great question. Perfect. Cool. So Jared,
All right.
share the
Yeah.
next key
So
concept.
the next key concept, and this one goes a little bit beyond just JavaScript programming, because other languages have this as well. But when in JavaScript, when you call a function, you pass variables to it. And depending on the type of those variables, it's either going to make a copy of that variable that gets passed to the function, or it's going to pass the actual reference to that variable, which if you then modify that inside the function, it's going to change that for the original object that got passed in. And this is a crucial distinction. And this is also very likely to get asked in many, many interviews.
Mm-hmm.
So just to explain that a little bit more, in JavaScript, the variables that get passed by reference are objects, and all the other primitive types, string, number, Boolean, are all passed by value. So Juan, what's a question you'd come up with to ask that concept?
Yeah, the way, let's say the way I ask usually this in interviews to my candidates is like this. And this is probably just going to sound very familiar for many out there. What's the difference, right? What's the difference between passing by reference and passing by value? Or they could ask it this way. What's passing by reference? What's passing by value? That's how they would ask it. And that's it. They're not going to add anything else to it. So then, you would use words like what Jared just explained to answer that question. But remember, you got to go read and understand this in fully. We're just doing a high level exposure here for you. But yeah, that's good.
The one bit I'd add to that is going on to potentially, after you kind of learn a little bit more pass by value, pass by reference, there's another concept you can kind of learn a little bit more about, which is not the whole scope of what pure functions are, but learning a little bit about them can help us better create functions that are better testable and more reliable than impure functions.
Okay, so go ahead and read and search anything you can about pure functions so you can understand this concept better, okay? Awesome. So the next topic, since you mentioned primitives, I think is the natural step there. This is also something that comes in a lot of new junior software engineer interviews. And that's because you got to know this for the language. If you're using JavaScript, you got to know this. So primitives, right? This is what you need to know, really. There's a primitive, right? And primitive is anything that is not an object in JavaScript. There's 6 primitives. So let's see if I can list them by memory. So we have integer, we have Boolean.
No, it's not integer, it's number.
We have it's actually big int. Big int is the official definition for the primitive.
Okay.
Number is just a type, right? So we have big int, we have Boolean, we have undefined, symbol, and there's 2 more. I don't remember, but remember, just go search for them, learn them, right? And also null is a special. I mean, null, sometimes people say like null is a primitive, but null is not really a primitive. It's a special case because null, the type of null is object. So there's like some gray area there. So null is a special case. It's not really a primitive, right? But you could count it as the 7th special primitive there. But yeah, so go search on that and find them. I mean, did I mention string? The string is another one. Yeah, I don't remember the other 2, but like, you can search them. I don't have them memorized by heart. I mean, I know I could make the list and everything. Yeah, Jared, how would you ask this in an interview? What would be a good way to ask this in an interview?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think here what would be the best one other than the obvious, which would be, what are the X primitive values in JavaScript? I guess you could say which are the most commonly used ones in JavaScript and ensure that the answer is void of any objects or any things that are not primitive values would I think be the core thing there. So like if you wanted to talk about the core ones there, you have int, string, Boolean, I guess null, And isn't undefined also technically the primitive?
It's a
Or
primitive, yeah. So it's everything that is not an object and has no method. And you're thinking about it when you were mentioning this, we both are right. So number is a primitive. Number is a primitive, and big int is a primitive. So we have number, big int, string, symbol, undefined, and Boolean. That's the 6 right there. And null, the special one. Awesome. Okay. So I corrected that. there. Cool.
All right. So it's my turn to talk about the next topic. So another aspect that's a little bit more unique to JavaScript is this idea of truthy and falsy. Now, this is not just simply a shorthand in JavaScript, but it's one of the most powerful features in JavaScript. So the idea a little bit behind truthy and falsy is that if you have a conditional, like an if statement, you're saying if, and then inside of your parentheses, you can pass in variables just as the variable name. So you could say if name, for example. Let's say you have a name variable that's tied to some sort of input field of a name. What's cool with truthy falsy is that you can do a conditional just on that name, and it's either going to resolve to true or it's going to resolve to false, and then you can do things accordingly. This is really nice because you don't have to type the super verbose version of saying, if name does not equal an empty string, then do this, right? So I want to ask you, how would you pose a question around truthy and falsy?
Yeah. So that one is easy. That one usually comes like this. What's the difference between truthy or falsy? That's one format. Or another format is like, hey, how would you define truthy? How would you define falsy? And something I want, and that will be the questions there. Something I want to add, like I like to share this easy definition with my students so they know how to explain truthy and falsy better, like in a very clean way. So truthy is when a variable evaluates to true or false when it's in a Boolean context. So Boolean context would be, for example, that if parentheses, the if condition. That's a Boolean context. Another Boolean context would be maybe when you use the not operator, right? The exclamation mark operator twice. That's a Boolean context right there. You do it twice, you're going to get the truthy or falsy value. Or when you do a comparison also, you're going to get that, well, no, comparison actually doesn't do the truthy or falsy. That's different. So falsy would be when the value evaluates to false in a Boolean context. So the key thing here, like how I remember this is, remember, Boolean context. Evaluates to true is truthy, evaluates to false is falsy, Boolean context. And that's going to help you nail the interview. That's a good one. And that's a hard one. Yeah.
The other aspect that I'd add to it, and this is something I would encourage students to go and practice, is, create a little if statement and then try passing in different data types into it and see what things resolve to true and what things resolve to false. Because if you pass a number in versus passing a string in, they're going to behave differently on what's true and what's not, depending on the data type. So that's going to be crucial. There's a lot of bugs around people being too loose with truthy falsy in regards to numbers, and as you explore it, you'll see what that is.
Yeah, go read everything you can about truthy falsy. Go play with the code. Do what Jared said. Play with if conditions. We just pass in a string, an empty string, a string with a value, an empty array, an array with values. Compare that, or use the not operator twice, and that will give you also the truthy or falsy value there. They will give you true or false. So that you gotta play with this in the code to fully understand it. So go read and play with it. So this is like very essential, and it will come in a technical interview. That was a good one, and that's a hard one. That's always a hard one to explain. Okay, so since we're talking about hard ones, right, that are still basic, I mean, because this is just fundamentals of JavaScript. Anybody who says, I'm working with JavaScript, I know React, right, they need to know these things, because as you mentioned a couple of episodes ago, Jared, you said that usually most of the students, when they have a struggle, it's not a struggle with React. They know React, they know how to use the API, they have these struggles with JavaScript. So that's why, like, these interviews can be demanding about JavaScript. In fact, most of the interviews, they will just ask you JavaScript fundamentals, and they're not gonna go deep in React or stuff like that for a junior software engineer. They're gonna just make sure that you actually know JavaScript. That's gonna open that gate, because if you know JavaScript, they know that you know how to figure out things with a specific framework. So the next one, since we're getting into more, a JavaScript flavor now, something that is essential that comes in every interview, where it's what is a JavaScript prototype? Probably you have heard this before, and this is a very tough one. And I messed up. I asked the question. So, but but okay, you can ask a different one because I mean you can ask this 10 different ways. There's more to it. So I'm gonna define that. So JavaScript prototypes, those are hard to explain, but really in a nutshell how it works or how I like to explain it is that in JavaScript, right, all the like objects inherit properties and methods through prototypes, okay? So that's kind of like, okay, inheritance, we have prototypes, but I'm not defining what a prototype is. So the way I like to define it is like a prototype is a working JavaScript object, okay? So that's very critical there. And the working JavaScript object, right, has property and methods, right? A property, you know, it's just a pair, key values. And I think that's it. That's kind of like what you need to remember. You know, you have key values, those are properties. Working JavaScript object, that's a prototype, and everything in JavaScript extends from and inherits from a prototype. For example, if you create a new date object, let's say you do new date, that object that you create is inheriting from or is pointing to the date dot prototype. Okay, so if you go and play with that, like this is a very complicating concept, but it comes up a lot in interviews, and you gotta at least express that you understand sort of how it works. It takes a lot. So yeah, anything you would like to add, Jared, or other questions you would ask related to these like different questions?
Yeah, I mean, just a little bit more to add to prototypes in general. The idea is, you know, if you create your own object and you base that object on some previous object, you know, you're inheriting all the functionality from that parent object, anything that's defined on its prototype. And kind of what's important about that is that when you call your function on that new object, it's technically actually calling the function that exists in that previous object. And with that, it's important not to overwrite that prototype, because if you override that prototype, you're going to be changing functionality for any other objects that are relying upon it. So it's just something to be careful with not changing. Again, this is a more specific topic, like Juan said. It's important to know a little bit about it, but I wouldn't spend you know, hours and hours and hours in digging into it too deep.
Yeah, just play with it. Like, and what Jared said about like overriding, like just to give you a code snippet, when you ever seen, like, I mean, you listening out there, like if you see, for example, a string, capital S, a string dot prototype dot say hello equal to function, that's changing things in the prototype. You never want to do that. Okay, so keep that in mind. Just go read about it, and and you don't want to mess with those. Okay,
Yeah,
cool. So
totally.
Jared, what's the next one?
Yeah, so the next one has to do with basic array functions. So one of the nice things about JavaScript is that they've created a bunch of functions that you can run directly on arrays. And no matter what array you have, you can run these. So the most common ones are map, reduce, filter, find, splice, and slice. Now, we don't need to ask questions about all of them, but it's important to be able to be prompted by a question that's, you know, about how to get this out of the array, or how to whatever, and I'm leaving it vague intentionally there. What array function would you use? Because, you know, in a real job, you're not going to be expected to rebuild what these array functions are doing. Instead, you know, you're expected to utilize them and leverage them, you know, for what you want. So I would, yeah, what are perhaps one or two questions that you would ask? And by the way, like the lead up to the question might be like, here's a data set, like a small array. And then you might be, you know, then I'll let you ask the question one.
Okay, yeah. So the question, one classical question is, okay, how would I remove the last element of the array? And remove is not setting it to undefined, like completely delete it from the array. That's one. Another one, how would you, like, let's say, get all this collection, like initialize this array, right? And fill it with certain numbers, right? So you have to be pushing, right? How would you remove the first element of the array? How would you find elements in the array? Like all these different things. So those key functions that we use, like push and shift, splice, slice. I mean, those that Jared mentioned, and for each, those are your best friends when it comes to working with arrays. And length, remember that property to know the length of the array. That's also very critical. So I'm going to take a little pause here, and I'm going to share here our Twitter. So if you are listening out there and you like what you're listening to and you want more content, you want to give us feedback, you want to share with your friends, we will appreciate it. So we're going to share our Twitters here.
Yeah, everyone can find me at twitter.com/Jared Potter. That's JaredPotter. And feel free to reach out to me, ask me questions, tell me what you're working on. I'd love to start a conversation.
And you can find me at twitter.com/Juan Lizarazo, and that's spelled JuanLizarazog. Okay. You're going to find that in whatever platform you're listening this to. We have these on the description, so you can just click there. You can follow us. You can give us a shout out. You can share what you're learning. You can give us feedback. Just let us know that you're enjoying this content, and we'll continue creating more. We have so much to share to help you land that first job, nail that first interview. So perfect. Okay, so moving on to our next question. So we talked about, okay, there's a classical one. Okay, so we covered prototypes. We're going into an advanced one, but we have forgotten a basic one that comes in. This is guaranteed. It comes in every junior software engineer interview. And this is, this goes to variable declarations. So variable declarations in 2020, we use let, const, and var. Okay. Well, not var really anymore. I'm going to share about that. So in 2020, we use let and const, right? So let, we use it to declare variables that are intended to be reassigned. You can reassign the value. So it's just a variable, okay? And const, we use it to declare these variables that are not intended to be reassigned. So const, you cannot reassign it after you initialize it. And you have to initialize it in the same line because it's a constant. But don't confuse this. A constant doesn't mean that it's immutable. Like a constant just means that it cannot be reassigned to another value. For example, if you initialize a value, a constant, right? Constant name equal to some object. Let's say we have a profile, some object, right? That means that you cannot reassign that constant to another object, but you can still change the property. So this can be confusing, but these are, there's a lot of trick questions that maybe they're coming through your mind now, Jared, about this, but those are trick questions that come a lot in interviews with these. And let's talk about var. Var, it is like the old way to declare variables. So in 2020, you should not be using var. Let and const. Why? Because let and const are scoped. So if you know difference between let and const and var. So let and constants are scoped. If you declare them in a function, they're just available in that function. With var, it's different because there's a concept called hoisting, which the values are declared at the very top of the block. But with var, we don't really, like, they're not really scoped. So for example, you declare var inside a for or inside an if, that is going to be available at the top of the function. So that can create a lot of side effects and bugs. And I personally have run into a lot of those issues. That was prior having let and const available. So 2020, use let and const. And remember, var, 2020, you shouldn't be using it. Why? Hoisting. Go read about it. Everything you can is it's spelled Hoisting,
Yep.
okay? And yeah, Jared, so give me some questions about, I mean, you can have like at least 5 questions regarding this. So give me
Oh,
two
absolutely.
questions.
Absolutely. So obviously the most basic version that you're going to get asked is what's the difference between let and const, or the interviewer might also ask what's the difference between let, const, and var. Those are definitely some basic examples that you might get asked. I might ask a few more, you could say, specific questions. I might show a little bit of code that shows maybe I create an object with some properties and I initialize it to have a const prefix. And then I'm going to go down below and I'm going to change one of the properties on that object. And I'm going to basically ask, hey, is this going to break this or not? Because that's going to show me whether or not they understand really what let and const are doing, not just in the context of a like a primitive value, but also in an object. And that gets to what Juan was saying. And I really liked that Juan was hit right on the head there, is that const has to do with reassignability, not changed. Okay, because people will oftentimes say that all the time, and I say this with my students as well. When I ask them, like, what does const mean? I mean, it means you cannot reassign that that variable, right? Now, if it's an object, you can still reassign, and this is what the immutability or the mutability talks about. You can change the properties on an object, but you cannot reassign that top level object there. So I really liked how that was really clear. So if you are asked that question, use the phrase reassign. Don't use the word change. Change is a really wishy-washy word that could mean either, immutable or
reassign. That's the keyword for const. You cannot reassign. Okay, so go read everything you can about it.
Yeah, and I would just also add that, I mean, like Juan is saying, I have this opinion, he has this opinion, and I wouldn't even say it's an opinion at this point, but a lot of the people, if you're asked, hey, do we use var in 2020? Really, the answer should be no.
Yeah, no, that's why JavaScript evolved to let and cons. Okay, and I see people like I have teams using still var, and I'm like always working hard for them to get away from that because it creates bugs, it creates issues, right? Especially if you don't understand. If you understand it, usually you'll be fine, right? But usually people do not understand it. That hosting concept. Awesome. So Jared, what's the next key concept that our audience need to know for their next technical interview?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a lot of conversation around data structures and algorithms, right, as being very common interview questions. And at least in my opinion, I think that there are a lot of different types of data structures out there. And of course, lots of algorithms that go along with those data structures in order to sort them and define things in them. But there really are two core data structures in JavaScript and other programming languages that are important to know and to know how to use and when to use one over the other for a particular example. These two data structures are an array and a map. And the kind of fun thing about a map is that in JavaScript, an object is technically a map, and it can be used as a primitive map if that's just what you need. Now, there is a dedicated map object in JavaScript as well, that if you're using a lot more data or more complicated data, then you would use that. But these are the two core data structures. So I want to know maybe a couple of questions that you might ask, or maybe even a couple of examples of like, I don't want to get into it, but what are some two different like types of data sets where one is going to be more appropriate for a map and one's going to be more appropriate for an array?
Yeah. So one like there's so many things we could answer regarding these, right? But really the map, right? The map goes down to being just more like a hash map, right? That you can also emulate using just a plain object literal, right? So that comes to having key value pairs and the key, right? So key and value, this is a key and value. You have a key and a value associated to that key. For example, let's say I have a key called Juan, and the value is my metadata, my age, my address, different metadata that matches that. If you have that type of a structure, a map or a object, right, a hash map is going to be better because remember, an array is a collection. So you can just have the items, but you don't really have a special identifier. I mean, you could have identifiers, like you can use string indexes, but usually you stick with just the automated numeric auto-assigned indexes for the array. So usually when you want fast searches on data, right, and you have a defined index, key values, right, a defined identifier, you want to find, you can find, you find that a map is better. So I would recommend like read everything you can about maps, read everything you can about arrays. And while you're at it, read everything you can about sets, because they're kind of like, they come also along these mix. The interview question could be as simple as like examples of like when would be appropriate using one or the other, probably code snippets. The basic question would be like, what's the difference between an array and a map, right? Kind of like usually for junior interviews, we want to use key concepts. So, hey, do you know about map? No? Okay, look, a map is something like this, right? There's native map. So these are things that in 2020 you should know because they've been around for about 5 years, okay? The maps. So they're native to JavaScript. They've been around for about 5 years. All vendors support it today now, right? So you should know that, and that's an advanced one. I mean, I don't think that's but it's good to create this exposure so then you know more about it, because you're gonna stumble upon that, or playing with collections, right? They're gonna ask you a lot of arrays things, so it's good that you know that difference or that clarification. But that's a good one and a hard one, Jared. So So the next one, and this is a basic one that guaranteed is gonna come in your next interview, right? In your next junior software engineering technical interview. And this is what's the difference? Well, it's really like it has to no sorry it has to do about like comparisons. When you use the double equal or you use the triple equal, right? There's something called loose comparison, which is the double equal, or a strict comparison, which is the triple equal. And what this means is that when you use double equal, you're just comparing the value, but not the type. So for example, I could compare number 2 equal and a string with the value of 2. And that's going to be true. But when you do a strict comparison, when you use the 3 triple equal, it's going to compare value and type. So that means that number 2 triple equal, a string with a value of 2 is going to be false. So a strict comparison, loose comparison. And usually they will tell you like double equal or triple equal, or they will just talk about a strict comparison or loose comparison. So Jared, an example for an interview question that would ask this, maybe let's give them 2 formats, 2 flavors of how they can be asked this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, of course, I mean, a basic version of this question is going to be, what's the difference between using double equals and triple equals? They might even ask kind of a twist to that. It's like, okay, well, most programming languages only use double equals. So what does it mean that there's triple equals in JavaScript? And how does that play? You could also definitely show some sort of code example where you perhaps have the double equals in there, and maybe ask them, hey, what's wrong with this, or what would you change about it, if anything? This double equals and triple equals definitely connects into truthy falsy a bit, as well, as you kind of start playing around with both of those. But in general, we always want to be using the triple equals in every context. Or of course, if it's the inverse version, the not version, it's exclamation mark equals, which is the equivalent.
Because it's a strict comparison, and because it's strict means that less room for mistakes, so less room for bugs. Because if not, usually, and consistency is good instead of mixing all over. Awesome. So Jared, we're out of time now, so let's do this. Let's share other key concepts. Just list them. Other key concepts you want to share with the audience, and they will do their homework, they will do the research, but things they should know for the next interview. Just list them. Whatever else you have.
Definitely. So I would recommend students check out arrow functions, and not just arrow functions, but also how does this keyword change in that context. In addition to that, I would also look up JavaScript promises and how those work, and how you work with them. The difference between require and import. Require is kind of the older common JS version, and import's the ES6 version.
And that has to do more about modules and Node.js, okay? So keep that in mind. Because then get confused.
Yeah, and then lastly, I would say ternary operations. So this is kind of a little bit of a pull from the React world, is you use ternaries quite a bit when you're defining to either render this code or not render this code. So understanding how ternary conditionals and assignment works would be my last topic to add. So I'd love to hear the other topics perhaps on your list, if you had any others.
I mean, you pretty much covered them, the ones I had in mind too. Like, so I'm going to turn them into questions. They're going to ask you, what is a promise, right? How would you define a promise? What's the difference between an arrow function and a normal function expression? What is an anonymous function? This one is critical. Those are the other questions you can come up with. The answers, you got to do your homework, research, find the answer yourself there. But we're exposing you here. When is a good idea to use a ternary? When is a bad idea to use a ternary? One that sometimes comes up is like, hey, what is ECMAScript? What is ES 2020? What is ES 2015? What is ES 2017? Like this ES ECMAScript, what is that, right? So go find about ECMAScript, go find about these different versions that I just provided. And yeah, I think you.
And then just to recap the topics that we did talk about, though, we talked about null versus undefined. We talked about pass by value versus pass by reference, primitive types, truthy falsy, the prototypes and the prototypical inheritance in JavaScript, array functions, var, const, and let, data structures in an initial state, as well as double equals versus triple equals and what those mean. So that's the recap.
Awesome. Cool. So that's it for today. Thank you so much. Remember, if you like this content, follow us on Twitter. You'll find the links in the description. If you don't have Twitter, then follow us in whatever platform you're listening these to. Okay. So Spotify, YouTube, Public, Radio, Radio Public. I think that's the name of the platform we're on too. Pocket Podcast, right? We're going to be going live on iTunes, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio in the next few days. So we'll let you know when that happens. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for being on our third episode of Dev Bootcamp Live. This was Juan Lizarazo.
And this is Jared Potter.
Thank you so much. See you next time.